Welcome to the final chapter of Power Unchecked. We've spent 5 episodes pulling back the curtain on how power operates in the shadows, how it corrupts individuals, how institutions become fortresses of impunity, how psychological manipulation warps reality itself, how silence is weaponized, and how accountability systems are gutted from within. We've mapped the architecture of a rigged game. But understanding how the machinery of power works is only half the battle. The evidence reveals the real question. Can we actually rebuild it? Can we create systems that serve justice rather than protect the powerful? Look, I'm not here to sell you fairy tales about easy fixes or feel-good platitudes about the arc of justice. The forces we've dissected don't just surrender because we've figured them out. They adapt, they evolve, they find new ways to operate. They have teams of lawyers, PR firms, and lobbyists whose full-time job is to maintain their advantages. But here's what's striking. They're not invincible. They have pressure points. They have weaknesses. And most importantly, they depend on our compliance, our silence, our cynicism, our willingness to look the other way. Today, we're going to explore how to exploit those weaknesses systematically, how to turn the very mechanisms of power against itself. We'll examine how stories and data, the twin engines of modern control, can be reclaimed as tools of liberation. We'll look at historical moments when entrenched power actually lost and analyze why those victories happened. And we'll confront the uncomfortable truth that building accountability isn't about finding the perfect system. It's about creating ongoing tension, permanent vigilance, and structural friction that makes corruption costly instead of profitable. Ever notice how power always promises that this time will be different? That these leaders are the ethical ones? That's not naivety. That's the con. And once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. Systems don't break by accident. They're dismantled, piece by people who benefit from their dysfunction. When I talk about rebuilding institutional integrity, I'm not talking about tweaking the rules around the edges or adding another layer of bureaucracy. I'm talking about fundamentally rewiring how power operates at the most basic level. Because here's what the evidence shows. The current system isn't broken. It's working exactly as designed. The revolving door between government and industry, that's not a bug, it's a feature. The toothless oversight bodies, they're performing their intended function perfectly, creating the illusion of accountability while protecting the very interests they're supposed to regulate. Real reform starts with this recognition. We're not fixing a broken system. We're dismantling a rigged one and building something entirely different in its place. This isn't renovation, it's reconstruction from the foundation up. Take independent oversight bodies. Right now, they're independent the way a dog on a leash is independent. Technically free to move, but only within very carefully defined limits. Real independence means structural independence. Separate funding streams that can't be cut by the industries they regulate, hiring processes that can't be influenced by political appointees, and most crucially, the legal authority to impose consequences that actually hurt. The research shows this isn't theoretical, it's mathematical. Every dollar invested in truly independent oversight returns $17 in recovered funds and prevented abuse. But here's the catch. That return comes at the expense of the very people who control oversight budgets. It's not an accident that inspector general offices are chronically underfunded. It's strategic. The revolving door isn't just about individual corruption. It's about institutional capture at a systemic level. When the people writing the rules used to work for the companies being regulated and plan to work for them again after their public service, whose interests do you think they're really serving? This isn't coincidence. It's systematic institutional capture, and it requires systematic solutions. We need to force a real choice, public service or private enrichment, but not both. Not before, not after, not during. Make it a lifetime commitment with lifetime consequences. The research from countries that have implemented these barriers shows dramatic improvements in regulatory effectiveness within just a few years. Here's the twist about ethical leadership that business schools won't teach you. Every corrupt leader I've encountered believed they were ethical. They had elaborate justifications, sophisticated rationalizations, complete moral frameworks that explained why their behavior was not just acceptable, but necessary for the greater good. The problem isn't that we need leaders with better intentions. The problem is that we've built systems where good intentions are structurally irrelevant, where the incentive structures reward unethical behavior regardless of personal values. Research on organizational behavior shows that ethical decision-making deteriorates predictably under certain conditions: when oversight is weak, when personal benefits are high, and when rationalization mechanisms are readily available. This isn't about moral weakness, it's about psychological reality. The most dangerous assumption in accountability design is that good people will naturally do good things when the system rewards them for doing bad things. This is where transparency becomes a weapon. Not the performative transparency of press releases and public statements, but the brutal transparency of real-time financial disclosure, algorithmic auditing of decision-making patterns, and public databases of conflicts of interest. When every interaction, every financial benefit, every relationship that could influence a decision is visible and searchable, ethical behavior stops being a choice and starts being a survival mechanism. The strongest oversight systems produce the most ethical behavior, not because they attract more moral people, but because they make unethical behavior professionally suicidal. And here's something they don't teach in business school: the most dangerous leaders aren't the obviously corrupt ones. They're the ones who have convinced themselves that their personal interests and the public good just happen to align perfectly every single time. These are the leaders who need the strongest guardrails, because they don't even recognize when they're crossing ethical lines. Psychological research identifies this as motivated reasoning, the unconscious tendency to process information in ways that support preferred conclusions. When leaders have significant personal stakes in outcomes, their ability to objectively assess ethical implications systematically deteriorates. They're not lying to you, they're genuinely convinced they're doing the right thing. This makes them more dangerous than obviously corrupt actors, because they operate with moral confidence while making systematically biased decisions. Let's talk about stories, because this is where the real battle for accountability is being fought every single day. Every abuse of power comes with a story designed to justify it, normalize it, or make you forget about it entirely. It's just how business works. Everyone does it. You can't make an omelet without breaking some eggs. This is necessary for economic growth. These aren't explanations. They're narrative weapons designed to short-circuit your moral reasoning. They're crafted by teams of PR professionals who understand exactly which psychological buttons to push to make you accept the unacceptable. Climate change denial campaigns, funded by fossil fuel entities for decades, haven't just disputed scientific findings. They've systematically constructed alternative reality frameworks that make environmental destruction seem inevitable, even deserved. The first step in reclaiming accountability is refusing to accept these prepackaged stories about how power works. But here's what's encouraging. Research reveals that narrative control depends on credibility, not volume. One whistleblower with documentation can unravel years of carefully constructed public relations. One investigative reporter with access to internal communications can expose what millions of dollars in corporate messaging tried to hide. Truth doesn't need to be louder than lies. It just needs to be more precise, more documented, and more persistent. But here's the catch. Truth-telling increasingly requires financial independence from the systems being investigated. This is why supporting independent media isn't just about journalism. It's about maintaining the infrastructure of accountability itself. When media outlets depend on advertising from the same industries they're supposed to investigate, or when journalists' career prospects depend on maintaining access to powerful sources, the story changes before it's even told. Independent funding creates independent thinking. The countries with the strongest press freedom have the most independent media funding. This isn't coincidence, it's causation. When journalists don't have to worry about losing access or advertising revenue, they can focus on the story instead of the consequences of telling it. Data is fascinating because it's both the ultimate tool of control and potentially the ultimate tool of liberation. The same technologies that enable mass surveillance can also enable mass accountability if we're smart about how we deploy them. The question isn't whether we'll live in a world of ubiquitous data collection. We already do. The question is, who gets to use that data and for what purposes? And here's what's striking. If they're going to collect everything anyway, let's make sure the collection runs both ways. Let's make sure that the same level of scrutiny applied to ordinary citizens gets applied to those who hold power over them. Open data initiatives sound boring, but they're revolutionary when properly implemented. When government contracts, financial flows, and decision-making processes become publicly searchable databases, corruption becomes statistically detectable. Patterns that would take investigators years to uncover become visible to anyone with basic data analysis skills. Suddenly, accountability isn't dependent on having insider access or investigative resources. It's dependent on having internet access and knowing how to use spreadsheet software. The research from countries that have implemented comprehensive open data systems shows dramatic results. Ukraine's procurement transparency reduced corruption incidents by 15% within 2 years. Sri Lanka's e-procurement analysis exposed systematic failures in oversight that had been invisible for decades. When you can cross-reference contracts, payments, and decision-makers algorithmically, patterns of abuse become undeniable. But here's the double-edged nature of data. The same technologies that can expose corruption can also be used to silence whistleblowers, track dissidents, and manipulate public opinion at unprecedented scale. The battle for accountability in the digital age isn't just about access to information. It's about who controls the algorithms that determine what information we see, when we see it, and how we interpret it. The key insight: data without algorithmic transparency is just surveillance with better public relations. We need to understand not just what data is being collected, but how it's being processed, by whom, and for what purposes. The Netherlands provides a model here. Their comprehensive algorithm risk assessment framework emerged after their own algorithm-based fraud detection system was found to violate European law. History has a fascinating way of repeating the same patterns while everyone involved insists this time is different. Every major reform movement in American history has faced the same argument. You can't change the system. It's too powerful, too entrenched, too essential to how things work. The people defending the status quo always claim that change is impossible, that the system is too big to fail, too important to modify. And yet, somehow, the system has been changed. Not easily, not quickly, and never permanently. But it has been changed, repeatedly, by people who refuse to accept that the current arrangement was natural or inevitable. The robber barons said industrial regulation was impossible. The segregationists said civil rights was impossible. The tobacco companies said health regulations were impossible. They were all wrong, and they all knew they were lying. Standard Oil was considered invincible until it wasn't. The rule of reason introduced in that antitrust case still shapes enforcement today. What's instructive about these historical victories isn't just that they happened. It's how they happened. They didn't succeed because reformers found the perfect argument or the perfect leader. They succeeded because they made the status quo more expensive to maintain than changing it. They created costs, political costs, economic costs, social costs, that made resistance unsustainable. The civil rights movement didn't succeed through moral persuasion alone. It succeeded by making segregation economically and politically untenable through sustained economic pressure, legal challenges, and social disruption that made the costs of maintaining the system exceed the benefits of changing it. The establishment of regulatory bodies like the SEC wasn't the result of political leaders suddenly developing consciences. It happened because unregulated financial markets had become so destructive that even the wealthy realized they needed rules to protect their own interests. The 2008 financial crisis provides a more recent example. Basel III banking regulations weren't adopted out of goodness, but out of necessity. Power doesn't reform itself out of goodness. It reforms itself out of necessity. The key is creating the conditions where reform becomes the less expensive option than maintaining the status quo. We've spent a lot of time talking about how cognitive biases are exploited to maintain power. But here's something interesting. Those same biases can be turned against the systems that exploit them. Once you understand how the just world fallacy works, the tendency to believe that bad things only happen to people who deserve them, you can recognize it operating in real time. You can catch yourself thinking, well, they must have done something wrong when you hear about abuse of power. You can recognize when others are using this bias to dismiss legitimate concerns about institutional abuse. Climate change denial campaigns have systematically exploited this bias, constructing narratives that suggest environmental problems are somehow deserved or inevitable consequences of human nature rather than policy choices. But when you know how this works, when you can see the manipulation happening, it loses its power over you. The psychological research is clear. Consciousness of bias is the beginning of immunity to bias. You can't be manipulated by techniques you understand and recognize. The bystander effect, the tendency to assume someone else will act when witnessing wrongdoing, is particularly insidious in institutional settings. It's the psychological foundation of systemic abuse. But when you know about it, when you can name it, it loses its power. Suddenly, that voice in your head saying, "Someone else will handle this," becomes recognizable as a psychological trap, not a reasonable assessment of the situation. Studies demonstrate that employees are actually less likely to report wrongdoing if they know others are also aware of it. This isn't rational evaluation, it's cognitive manipulation that requires recognition for immunity. Here's what they don't want you to realize. Most of the psychological techniques used to maintain power only work when they're invisible. Gaslighting stops working when you know what gaslighting is. Authority bias becomes manageable when you understand that your instinct to defer to power is just that, an instinct, not a moral obligation. Knowledge isn't just power. It's immunity. When you understand how institutional gaslighting works, how systems routinely dismiss and minimize experiences of abuse, you can resist it. Research on Puerto Rican women with fibromyalgia shows how medical institutions systematically dismiss their physical experiences as psychological, demonstrating how intersectional identities compound institutional bias. But recognition of these patterns enables conscious resistance. Here's the uncomfortable reality about fighting unchecked power in the 21st century. National borders have become largely irrelevant to how power actually operates. Multinational corporations shop for the most favorable regulatory environments. Wealthy individuals park their assets in jurisdictions with the strongest secrecy laws. Influence campaigns cross borders seamlessly, while accountability systems remain stubbornly national. We're fighting 21st century power with 20th century institutions, and it shows. The scale of this mismatch is staggering when you look at the numbers. Countries lose over $427 billion annually to international corporate tax abuse. That's not just money, that's hospitals, schools, infrastructure, and social services that can't be funded because wealth has been systematically hidden from accountability. The offshore systems implicated in every major financial scandal, Enron, Parmalat, the 2008 crisis, continue to operate with impunity because they exist in the gaps between national jurisdictions. The Panama Papers, the Paradise Papers, the Pandora Papers, these weren't just journalism scoops. They were glimpses into a parallel financial system that operates completely outside the reach of traditional accountability mechanisms. When the president of Ukraine and the king of Jordan can be exposed as having secret offshore holdings, but face no meaningful consequences, you start to understand the scale of the accountability deficit we're dealing with. The Colombian evidence is particularly striking. When wealthy taxpayers face wealth taxes, they don't pay them, they hide their assets. Exposure without enforcement infrastructure fails accountability. This demonstrates why piecemeal national approaches are insufficient for global problems. International cooperation sounds great in theory, but in practice, it means getting countries to agree to investigate their own powerful citizens and potentially lose the economic benefits those citizens bring. It means creating enforcement mechanisms with real teeth, not just agreements that look good in press releases. Look at the OECD Anti-Bribery Convention. 50 countries, 1,200 cases, 440 convictions since 1999. Sounds impressive until you realize that 60% resulted in fines without custodial sentences. Asset recovery has frozen or recovered $4.2 billion since 2015, but repatriation is systematically delayed. This is accountability theater on a global scale, the appearance of enforcement without the substance. Let me be absolutely clear about something. I am not an optimist. Optimism is for people who haven't spent enough time studying how power actually works. When you understand the systematic nature of institutional capture, the sophistication of psychological manipulation, and the global scale of financial secrecy, naive optimism becomes impossible. But I'm also not a pessimist, because pessimism is just another form of surrender, another way of avoiding the responsibility that comes with understanding how these systems work. What I am is a strategic realist. I believe in facing facts, understanding systems, and then figuring out how to exploit their weaknesses systematically. Hope isn't about believing everything will work out. Hope is about believing that intelligent action can make a difference, that understanding systems creates the possibility of changing them. And the research supports this belief. The evidence shows that these systems can be disrupted, that power can be held accountable, that change is possible when the right pressure is applied in the right places. The forces we've examined, institutional capture, psychological manipulation, enforced silence, accountability theater, they're formidable. But they're not invincible because they depend on conditions that can be changed. They depend on public ignorance, individual isolation, and institutional capture. Remove any one of those conditions, and the whole system becomes vulnerable. The research shows us multiple examples where these conditions have been successfully disrupted. The Me Too movement didn't just change individual behavior. It forced institutional changes, including new codes of conduct, salary transparency requirements, and power structure restructuring. Taiwan's Me Too amendments in 2023 led to 40% increased reporting and 20% more successful prosecutions. ESG shareholder resolutions increased from 10% to 35% between 2018 and 2024, with 15% improvement in board diversity. This series has been my attempt to map those pressure points for you, to show you how the machine works so you can see where to put the wrench. The power paradox, institutional impunity, psychological manipulation, enforced silence, accountability theater, these aren't just problems to complain about. They're mechanisms to understand, anticipate, and ultimately circumvent. But understanding alone is insufficient. Knowledge without action is just intellectual tourism, but action without knowledge is just noise. The research consistently shows that successful accountability movements combine deep systemic understanding with sustained strategic pressure. They don't just identify problems. They identify the specific mechanisms that maintain those problems and develop targeted interventions to disrupt those mechanisms. As we wrap up Power Unchecked, here's what I want you to remember. Accountability isn't a destination. It's a practice. It's not something you achieve once and then maintain automatically. It's something you have to actively create every day in every interaction, through every choice to speak up instead of staying silent, to investigate instead of assuming, to demand evidence instead of accepting assurances. The research on institutional maintenance is clear. Systems don't maintain themselves. They require constant vigilance, continuous oversight, and regular renewal. The price of accountability is eternal vigilance, not because that sounds dramatic, but because that's literally how accountability works mechanically. Historical analysis shows that every major accountability system that has collapsed did so during periods when public attention and engagement decreased. The collapse isn't sudden, it's gradual, as oversight mechanisms are quietly defunded, as transparency requirements are quietly rolled back, as enforcement becomes quietly discretionary. Structural reforms matter, ethical leadership matters, narrative control matters, data transparency matters. But they all matter only as much as we make them matter. Systems don't maintain themselves. They maintain themselves only as long as enough people care enough to maintain them. The moment we stop paying attention, the moment we decide that someone else will handle it, that's the moment accountability dies. Every successful reform we've examined required sustained public engagement over years or decades. The civil rights movement, environmental protection, financial regulation, anti-corruption efforts all required continuous pressure from engaged citizens who refused to accept that someone else would handle systemic problems. Democracy isn't a spectator sport, and neither is accountability. Both require active participation, not passive observation. They require citizens who understand how power works and are willing to use that understanding to hold power accountable. The global nature of modern power means we can't solve this problem within the comfortable boundaries of national politics. We need international coordination, but more than that, we need a shared understanding that unchecked power anywhere threatens accountability everywhere. When oligarchs can launder their reputations in London, hide their money in Delaware, and buy influence in Washington, geography becomes irrelevant. The interconnected nature of global finance, information systems, and political influence means that corruption in one jurisdiction undermines accountability in all others. Unchecked power is like a virus that spreads across borders faster than accountability mechanisms can contain it. It spreads until it's stopped, and it can only be stopped by coordinated, sustained, intelligent resistance that understands how it operates and targets its specific vulnerabilities. This concludes Power Unchecked: How Wealth and Influence Enable Abuse. We've taken a hard look at how power operates when it thinks no one is watching, how it protects itself when it's caught, and how it manipulates reality when it's threatened. We've mapped the architecture of impunity that surrounds us every day, from the psychological techniques that make us blame victims, to the institutional mechanisms that shield perpetrators, to the global financial systems that enable wealth to operate beyond the reach of justice. But mapping the problem was never the point. Understanding how to dismantle it systematically was the point. To everyone who stayed with us through these difficult conversations, who resisted the urge to look away when the analysis got uncomfortable, who chose to understand rather than simply judge, thank you. This work only matters if people are willing to engage with it, to wrestle with its implications, and ultimately to act on its insights. The research we've covered, the mechanisms we've exposed, the pressure points we've identified, they only have value if they translate into informed action. The most dangerous response to understanding how power works is to do nothing with that understanding. Knowledge is not neutral. It creates moral obligation. Once you understand how these systems operate, your silence becomes complicity. Your action becomes resistance. Your vigilance becomes accountability. This isn't about being a hero or changing the world single-handedly. It's about understanding your role in maintaining or dismantling systems of impunity. Every time you choose to investigate rather than assume, every time you demand transparency rather than accept assurances, every time you support independent oversight rather than convenient excuses, you're participating in the infrastructure of accountability. You're making power a little more expensive to abuse and a little easier to hold accountable. The systems we've examined are powerful, but they're not more powerful than informed, sustained, coordinated resistance. They depend on our ignorance, our isolation, our cynicism. Remove those dependencies and you remove their power. If we want justice, we have to take the machine apart. Gear by gear, institution by institution, narrative by narrative. The choice is yours, but the choice is also urgent. Because while we've been analyzing how power works, power hasn't stopped working. It's been adapting, evolving, finding new ways to operate beyond accountability. The question isn't whether you'll live in a world shaped by unchecked power. You already do. The question is whether you'll help build the systems that can check it. Thank you for joining us for Power Unchecked. The conversation doesn't end here, it begins here. Because understanding is only the first step. What you do with that understanding is what matters now. For detailed source materials, additional research, and action resources mentioned in this series are here. If this series has changed how you see power, share it with others who need to understand these systems. The infrastructure of accountability depends on informed citizens who refuse to look away. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay informed, and remember, accountability isn't something that happens to you, it's something you create.